Dean Martin walked into the studio one day after his brother's death. Nobody expected to see him there. The funeral had been only 24 hours before. The journalists still hovered outside the Catholic cemetery in Los Angeles, their cameras flashing like fireflies in the darkness. The city still whispered about the death of Guy Crosetti, Dean's older brother, the man who had known Dean when he was just Dino Crosetti, a skinny, frightened kid from Steubenville, Ohio, with dreams bigger than the universe itself. To understand the weight of this moment, you have to understand who Guy Crosetti was and what he meant to Dean Martin. You have to understand the mythology of their relationship, the foundation upon which an entire empire of entertainment would be built. Guy Crosetti was not famous. He would never be famous. He would never stand on a stage or sing into a microphone or have his name in lights. But he was the most important person in Dean Martin's life, and everyone who knew Dean understood this truth. Guy was 7 years older than Dean, and in the world of Steubenville, Ohio, in the 1920s, that might as well have been a lifetime. He was Dean's protector, his guide, his believing mirror, when Dean was still just a kid who didn't believe in himself. Their father, Giovanni Crocetti, was a barber with rough hands and a rougher temperament. Their mother, Angela, was a saint who suffered in silence. They had nothing. They had less than nothing. They had debt and hunger and the kind of poverty that seeps into your bones and never quite leaves. But they had each other. And in particular, Dean had Guy. When the other kids mocked Dino for his accent, for his poor clothes, for the way his shoes had holes in the bottom, Guy was there. When their father drank too much and his voice became dangerous, when he looked at Dean with eyes that said the boy was a disappointment, a waste of space, a reminder of his own failures, it was Guy who pulled Dean aside and said, "Don't listen to him. He doesn't know what he's talking about. You're going to be something great. You're going to get out of here. You're going to be somebody that matters." These weren't just kind words. These were prophecies spoken by a brother who had already given up on his own dreams, who understood that his own escape was impossible, but who could still believe absolutely and completely in his younger brother's potential. That belief was a gift that money couldn't buy. That belief was the difference between a kid who gave up and a kid who kept trying. That belief was everything. When Dean was young, maybe 12 or 13 years old, he had made a promise to Guy. He said, "One day I'm going to be famous. One day I'm going to sing on stages that matter. One day people are going to know the name Crocetti. And when that happens, when I've made something of myself, you're going to be there. You're going to see it. You're going to know that you were right about me. You're going to know that all that belief you had wasn't wasted." Guy had smiled at him with eyes full of love and sadness because Guy already knew something that Dean didn't. Guy already understood that life doesn't always work out the way we hope. But he didn't tell Dean that. Instead, he just nodded and said, "I believe in you, little brother. I always will." And Guy kept that promise. He kept that belief alive through every failure, every setback. Every moment when it looked like Dean was going to be just another kid from a poor immigrant family, just another face swallowed up by the machinery of ordinary life. Guy watched from the sidelines as Dean slowly transformed into Dino Martini, then Dean Martin. Guy watched as his little brother slowly clawed his way up from dive bars and Mobron nightclubs. Guy watched as the world began to take notice. And when Dean finally made it, when he finally became the star he had always promised to be, Guy was there. He was always there. He was the foundation, the bedrock, the reason why. But life is cruel and time is a thief. Guy Crosetti got sick. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of illness that announces itself with trumpets and fanfare. It was the slow kind, the quiet kind, the kind that steals a person piece by piece until one day you realize they're mostly gone. Dean was in the middle of filming a movie when Guy died. Dean was in the middle of his life when his life's foundation simply gave way beneath him. And when the phone call came, when someone told him that his brother was gone, that the man who had believed in him before anyone else, who had sustained him through all the difficult years, who had been the reason for everything, was simply no longer in the world, Dean didn't know how to exist anymore. Nobody expected Dean to come to work. The producers of the show had the decency to cancel the week immediately. There had been phone calls of condolences from people all across the entertainment industry. There had been flowers delivered to his house, stacks and stacks of flowers, white ones and red ones and yellow ones. all of them trying to say in their own wordless way that people understood his loss. There had been respectful silence in the corridors of the Paramount Studios, that particular kind of quiet that falls over a workplace when someone has experienced a tragedy. There had been that uncomfortable politeness that people display when someone has just lost a piece of themselves, when they don't know what to say and so they say nothing at all. The entire machinery of entertainment had simply paused, waiting for Dean Martin to process the fact that the person who had made him possible was gone. But there was Dean Martin, walking through the gates on a Tuesday morning, walking through the gates on a day when he should have been in a cemetery or in his house or somewhere, anywhere, that wasn't here. He was wearing his perfectly pressed suit, the kind of suit that cost more money than his parents had made in a year during their entire lives. He was wearing his sunglasses even though it was 7:30 in the morning and the sun had barely risen above the buildings of Los Angeles. He was wearing his face, the face that had become famous, the face that belonged to an entertainer, not a man who was grieving. His face was a mask of absolute control, so perfect that you would think nothing inside him had broken, nothing inside him had shattered into 1,000 pieces. He had the same bearing, the same unpassioned elegance that had made him famous all across the world. You wouldn't have said at first glance that he had spent the night before kneeling beside a mahogany coffin, holding the hand of a brother who couldn't hold his back anymore. You wouldn't have known that he had pressed his forehead against that coffin and whispered, "Apologies for not being there when Guy took his last breath." You wouldn't have known that he had made a promise to that coffin, a promise that he would finish what Guy had started, that he would be everything Guy had believed he could be, that he would honor Guy's faith by making sure it was never wasted. You wouldn't have known any of this because Dean Martin had learned how to hide. He had learned how to smile while his heart was breaking. He had learned how to perform even when he was dying inside. The guards tried to stop Dean when he reached the iron gate. They didn't recognize him at first, or maybe they simply didn't believe that someone in his condition would show up for work on the day after burying his brother. They had no frame of reference for this. They didn't know what someone was supposed to do in this situation. Were they supposed to let him through? Were they supposed to stop him? Were they supposed to call someone? Dean simply looked at them, and there was something in his eyes that made them understand that stopping him would be futile, like trying to stop a wave from reaching the shore. Dean removed his sunglasses slowly, deliberately. His eyes were hollow, like someone had reached into him and removed something essential. His eyes were red from crying, though he hadn't cried in front of anyone and wouldn't. But his jaw was firm. His jaw was the jaw of a man who had made a decision and would see it through no matter what. "I work here," he said, and his voice was as flat as a tombstone, as empty as a church at midnight. The guard nodded without speaking and opened the gate. When Dean stepped into the main studio, the energy shifted immediately. People were there, scattered throughout the space, rehearsing other things, trying to stay busy, trying to fill the hours with activity so they wouldn't have to think about the fact that this was a studio that had just lost one of its most important stars, and that star was walking through their doors on the worst day of his life. The lighting was too bright, the kind of bright that comes from 1,000 bulbs working together, the kind of bright that leaves nowhere to hide. The background music was too loud, some orchestral piece that was supposed to be inspiring or uplifting but instead felt hollow and desperate. People were laughing too hard, as if they could somehow compensate through noise for the tension that permeated every corner of the space. When Dean appeared, everything stopped. The musicians lowered their instruments slowly, as if moving too quickly might shatter something fragile. The people who were laughing stopped mid-sound, their laughter dying in their throats. It was as if someone had pulled the plug on the world, and now they were all just standing there, waiting for something, anything, to start again. For a moment, there was a silence so complete that you could hear the electricity humming through the lights above. You could hear the ventilation system breathing. You could hear the heartbeat of the city outside the walls. The producer, a man named Frank Talbot, who had worked with Dean for 5 years, who had built an entire career around understanding Dean Martin's moods and needs, walked toward him. Frank was the kind of person who knew what to do in difficult situations. He was a veteran of the entertainment industry. He had seen actors come and go. He had seen careers rise and fall. He had seen people destroyed by fame and people destroyed by the loss of fame. He had seen scandals and betrayals and every kind of drama that money and celebrity could generate. But this was different. This was unprecedented. This was a territory he had no map for. Frank moved carefully, The way you move around a wild animal that might bolt or attack without warning. Frank understood that Dean was not fully present in this moment, that some part of Dean was still at the cemetery, still kneeling beside that coffin, still holding the hand of a brother who had become a ghost. "Dean," Frank said, and his voice was soft and cautious. "The way you speak to someone who is broken, we have plenty of time. The show isn't until Friday. We don't even need to start rehearsals until tomorrow. You don't need to be here. Nobody expects you to be here. You should be home. You should be with your family. You should be grieving." Dean looked at Frank as if he were seeing through him, as if Frank were made of glass and Dean could see something on the other side. The look in Dean's eyes was the look of someone who was seeing something that nobody else could see. The look of someone who was peering into a future that was already determined, that was already written. "I know nobody expects it," Dean said, and his voice was quiet but certain. "That's exactly why I'm here. I'm here because staying home would kill me. I'm here because sitting still would destroy me. I'm here because my brother spent his entire life believing in me, and I spent my entire life becoming the person he believed in, and now he's gone. He's gone and he'll never see me again. He'll never see what I'm going to do next. He'll never know if I was worthy of his faith. So I'm here. I'm here because being here is the only thing that keeps me tethered to this world." He walked toward the recording studio, and Frank didn't try to stop him again. Frank understood that there was something happening here that was bigger than logic, bigger than protocol, bigger than the normal rules of grief and professional behavior. Frank understood that he was witnessing something sacred. He understood that Dean Martin was not just coming to work. Dean Martin was coming to perform a funeral, right? Dean Martin was coming to sing a dirge for the dead. The studio was a cathedral of sound equipment and empty space. The microphone stood like a shrine in the center, waiting for a voice to fill it. The piano was closed, its lid down like the lid of a coffin, like something that was being kept sealed. The cameras were dark, their red lights extinguished. It all felt like a tomb dressed up as a workplace, like a mausoleum that had been converted into a space for entertainment. Dean stood in the middle of it all and looked around slowly, as if he were seeing it for the first time, or perhaps for the last time, as if this was a place he would never come back to after today. His hands trembled very slightly, just a small shaking that you would have to be looking closely to notice. But he clenched them into fists, and the shaking stopped. He had trained his body to obey his will. He had trained his body to perform even when his soul was screaming. He had trained his body to be an instrument of entertainment, and he would use that training now, in this moment, for a purpose beyond entertainment. He would use it to honor his dead. He walked to the piano and sat down on the bench slowly. Nobody had told him to do this. Nobody had asked for it. Nobody had suggested that this was something he should do. But the musicians in the outer room, hearing the piano bench scrape against the floor with a sound like nails on a blackboard, began to drift toward the studio windows like ghosts drawn to the living. They gathered in clusters, their faces pressed against the glass, watching. Frank stood behind the glass with his hand pressed against the window, as if he could push through it, as if he could somehow stop what was about to happen and prevent the pain that was about to be unleashed. Dean's fingers found the keys. He didn't warm up. He didn't do scales. He didn't do any of the things a professional does before performing, any of the rituals that prepared the voice and the body for the demands of singing. He simply began to play. The song was one that Guy had loved. It was something from the old days, from before Dean became famous, from when the two brothers would sing together in small clubs in Ohio, in the kind of places where nobody cared that they weren't famous yet, where the only audience that mattered was each other. It was a song about home, about family, about the weight of memory, and the way the past clings to you no matter how far you run. Dean's voice came out broken at first, like something learning to speak for the first time, like a baby bird trying to fly. The sound that came from him was not the perfectly polished voice that millions of people had paid money to hear. This was something else. This was something raw and real and absolutely devastating. The engineers in the booth froze. They didn't move, they didn't reach for buttons or dials. They just stood there and listened. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't on the schedule. This wasn't professional. This wasn't what entertainment was supposed to be. This was something else entirely. This was grief wearing the body of a man. This was loss given voice. The lyrics poured out of him like he was pouring out his own blood, like he was opening a vein and letting everything inside him spill out onto the floor. He sang about his brother. He sang about childhood. He sang about all the small moments that had built a life, all the conversations in dark rooms, all the laughter in kitchen corners, all the ordinary miracles of knowing someone so completely that they became part of your own existence. And when they were gone, when they simply stopped existing, when death had taken them from you and you were left here without them, you felt like half of yourself had been erased. His voice cracked on a high note, a real crack, not the kind you could fix with another take, not the kind that a good producer would edit out of the final recording. This was the kind of crack that happened when you were singing the truth, and the truth was too big to fit inside your body, too heavy for your lungs to carry. One of the cameramen turned away from the window. He couldn't watch. This was too intimate, too raw, too much like witnessing someone's actual heart being removed from their chest and held up to the light for everyone to see. Dean finished the song and his hands fell away from the piano keys like they weighed 1,000 pounds. The silence that followed was the heaviest silence in that studio, possibly in the entire world. It was the silence of a man who had just given everything and had nothing left. It was the silence of someone who had looked into the void and found nothing looking back. It was the silence of a man who realized that he had just done the most important thing he would ever do in his entire life, and his brother would never know about it. He sat there, completely still, for what felt like an eternity. The world seemed to have stopped. Time seemed to have stopped. The universe seemed to have paused to listen to what came next. Then he slowly stood up and turned to face the glass window where everyone was watching. And what he said, what came out of his mouth in that moment, would be repeated in Hollywood for decades. It would be quoted in newspapers and magazines. It would be whispered in bars and restaurants and at parties where people gathered to talk about the great stories of entertainment history. It would define, in many ways, who Dean Martin was beyond the fame and the songs and the perfect hair and the perfect smile. Dean walked to the glass and pressed his own hand against it, matching Frank's hand on the other side. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. There was nothing to say. Then Dean looked past Frank, looked past all of them, looked past the studio walls and into something beyond, and he spoke. His voice was so quiet they had to strain to hear it through the glass. So quiet it seemed like he was speaking to someone who wasn't in the room, someone who wasn't even in the world anymore. But everyone could hear him. Everyone heard every word. "I made a promise to my brother when I was 12 years old," Dean said. "We were poor. We were hungry. We were nothing. We were the kind of nothing that you can't come back from, the kind of nothing that defines your entire life. And I told him that one day I would make something of myself. I told him that one day the name Crocetti would mean something in this world. I told him that one day people would know that name. I told him I would sing on stages that mattered, stages where the lights were bright and the audiences were full of important people. I told him I would be somebody. I told him I would be a star. And he looked at me with those eyes of his, with eyes that had already seen too much disappointment and failure in his own life, and he believed me. He was older. He could have told me I was crazy. He could have told me to be realistic. He could have told me to grow up and stop dreaming impossible dreams, but he didn't. He looked at me with faith in his eyes, and he said, "You're going to make it, Dino. You're going to be a star. I believe in you." And he never doubted it. Not once in his entire life. Not when I failed. Not when I almost gave up. Not when it looked like I was never going to make it. He never stopped believing. Dean's voice broke here, but he kept going. He pushed through the pain like a man swimming through an ocean of fire, like someone wading through something that wanted to pull him under and drown him. His hands were clenched so tightly that his nails were drawing blood from his palms, but he didn't notice. He didn't care. "I did make something of myself," he continued. "I became that star. I sang on those stages. The name Crocetti became something. It became something that people knew. It became something that mattered. It became the name of a legend. But it took me getting here, to this moment, to this particular day, to realize something. It took me losing him to understand. None of it matters without him. None of these songs, none of these awards, none of this success, none of this money, none of this fame means anything if the person who believed in you first isn't here to see it. And I'm only now learning the cruelest lesson life has to teach. You can have everything and still lose the only thing that matters. You can achieve every dream you ever had and still be standing in an empty room, alone." He paused and looked directly at Frank. His eyes were full of tears now, tears that he didn't try to hide, tears that ran down his face like rain on a window. Then he said something that made Frank's knees buckle. made Frank have to grab onto the glass to stay standing. It made the cameraman turn back around and look. It made the musicians in the other room set down their instruments as if they were suddenly too heavy to hold. "My brother died yesterday," Dean said. "And I'm here today because I needed to feel something other than this emptiness. I needed to remember that I was trained to feel things in front of audiences. That's my job. That's what I do. I transform pain into art. I transform sorrow into song. I transform the unbearable into something that people can listen to and feel less alone. And so I came here. Not because I wanted to work, not because I didn't want to grieve. I came because I needed to sing for him one more time. I came because, as long as I can sing, as long as I can stand on a stage and move people, then some part of what he believed in is still alive. Some part of his faith in me is still real. Some part of him lives on in every song I sing." Dean put his sunglasses back on, even though he was indoors, even though it made no sense, even though it was absurd. But the sunglasses hid his eyes, and his eyes were too raw right now, too open, too vulnerable for anyone to see. "We're going to rehearse," he said quietly. "We're going to run through the show. And when Friday comes, when the cameras roll and the audience arrives, I'm going to perform like my brother is watching, because maybe he will be. And if there's any justice in this universe, if there's any peace anywhere, if there's any way that the soul persists after death, then maybe he'll finally get to see exactly how far his faith took me. Maybe he'll finally get to see that the promise I made to him was kept. Maybe he'll finally know that everything he believed in wasn't wasted." Frank still couldn't speak. The tears were running down his face, too. He nodded and turned away, unable to look at Dean anymore. Nobody could speak. The entire studio had been turned upside down by what they had just heard. They simply returned to their tasks with a different energy now, a different understanding of what they were doing here, a different sense of purpose. The studio felt different. It felt changed. It felt haunted, but not in a scary way. It felt like the presence of something sacred had entered this place and had changed it forever. It felt like the space had been transformed into something more than just a place where entertainment was manufactured. It felt like a shrine. It felt like a temple. It felt like a place where the living could speak to the dead. Over the next 5 days, Dean went through the motions of preparation. He didn't smile. He didn't joke. He didn't do any of the things that made Dean Martin, Dean Martin. He didn't charm anyone. He didn't flirt. He didn't work the room with his legendary charisma. He was a ghost, moving through a ghost world. But when he was in the studio, when his voice was being recorded, when the music was playing, he was fully present. He was fully alive. The pain that he was carrying had been transmuted into art. The grief that was tearing him apart had been transformed into something that could touch other people, something that could move them, something that could make them understand that death was real and loss was real, but beauty could be real too. Colleagues who worked with him during those days said later that they had never seen anyone like Dean in their entire lives. One cameraman said, "It was like watching someone work while they were underwater, like watching someone operate at a level that the rest of us couldn't even comprehend." Another crew member said, "He was present and absent at the same time. Like part of him was here with us and part of him was somewhere else, somewhere with his brother." A musician said, "I've worked with a lot of talented people in this business, but I've never seen someone put as much of themselves into a performance as Dean did during those days. It wasn't just singing. It was like he was pouring his soul out onto the stage." By the time Friday arrived, the energy in the studio had completely shifted. Word had gotten out about what had happened, about Dean coming in the day after his brother's funeral, about what he had said at the studio window. The story had spread through Hollywood like wildfire. People who had nothing to do with the show found reasons to be there on Friday night. Directors and producers and actors and musicians and people from all walks of the entertainment industry showed up because they had heard that they were about to witness something historic, something that would matter, something that they would be able to tell people about for the rest of their lives. When the audience came and the red lights went on, something shifted. Dean became someone else. Or maybe he became himself. Maybe he became the person his brother had always believed he could be, the person his brother had seen in him before anyone else could see it. The stage became sacred ground. The microphone became a confession booth. The audience became witnesses to something that transcended entertainment. They became witnesses to love and loss and the transformation of pain into beauty. He performed that week like a man possessed by something larger than himself. Every song was a prayer. Every gesture was weighted with meaning. Every note was a conversation between the living and the dead. His voice had a quality that nobody had ever heard before, a depth that came from somewhere deep in the human experience, a place where joy and sorrow are indistinguishable from each other. The audience felt something they couldn't name. They knew something profound was happening, but they didn't know what. They just knew that they were watching someone open his chest on stage and show them his actual heart. They knew that they were watching someone transform grief into grace. It was the most honest thing they had ever seen. It was the most beautiful thing they had ever heard. People in the audience cried. Grown men cried. People who never cried, cried. They cried because they understood, in that moment, that life was fragile and that the people we love could be taken from us at any moment. They cried because they understood that the pain of loss was the price you paid for loving someone. They cried because they understood that Dean Martin, the legend, the man who had seemed to have everything, was just like them. He was just a man who had loved his brother and had lost him, and that made him real. That made him human. That made him more of a star than he had ever been before. After the show on Friday night, Dean sat in his dressing room alone. The room was quiet. The applause had faded. The audience had gone home. The crew had cleaned up the stage and left. Now, there was just silence. There was just a man sitting in front of a mirror, looking at himself, trying to figure out who he was now that his brother was gone. There was a bottle of whiskey on the table and a photograph of Guy. Dean picked up the photograph and stared at it for a long time. His brother's face was young and proud and full of belief. His brother's face was the face of someone who had seen the future and had known that his little brother was going to be great. Dean raised the bottle in a silent toast. There was nobody to see him do this. There was nobody to witness this private moment between two brothers, one living and one dead. But Dean did it anyway. "I did it, Guy," he whispered to the photograph. "I did it. I made something of myself. I became the star you said I would be. But I finally understand now, and it only took losing you to figure it out. I finally understand that none of it was for me. It wasn't for me, it was for you. It was always for you. Every song, every performance, every moment of success was just me trying to make your faith in me real. Every time I stepped on a stage, I was trying to prove that you were right about me. Every time I hit a note perfectly, every time I made an audience laugh or cry or feel something, I was doing it to honor your belief." He paused and looked at the photograph more closely, trying to memorize every detail of Guy's face, trying to hold on to him in the only way he could now. "And now you're gone," he continued, "and I finally got here. I finally became everything you believed I could be. But nobody gets to tell you that you were right. That's the real tragedy. Not that I lost you. Not that I'm sitting here talking to a photograph like a crazy man, but that you left one moment too soon. You left 1 second before you could see that everything you believed in actually came true. You left before you could know that you were right, that you were always right, that your faith was never misplaced, that your little brother became the star, just like you said he would." He set the photograph down and drank the whiskey in one long pull. The burn of it matched the burn in his throat, and for a moment, it all felt right. The pain and the whiskey and the grief and the memory of a brother who had believed in him when he was nothing but a skinny kid with big dreams and a fear that he would never amount to anything. The pain and the loss and the knowledge that he would carry this moment with him for the rest of his life. The story of Dean Martin entering that studio one day after his brother's death became legend in Hollywood. It became the moment when people realized that underneath all that cool and charm and impeccable timing and perfect voice, there was something deeper. There was a man who loved fiercely and carried his losses like stones in his pockets, growing heavier every day. There was a man who understood, perhaps better than anyone, that everything we achieve in this life is ultimately for someone else, that we are all just trying to prove something to the people we love, that we are all just trying to make real the faith that other people had in us before we had faith in ourselves. Dean Martin continued performing for many more years after Guy's death. He became a legend, an icon, a standard by which all entertainers were measured. He won awards and accolades. He starred in movies that became classics. He released songs that topped the charts. He built an empire of entertainment that seemed unsurpassable. But those who worked with him knew that there was always a part of him that was somewhere else. A part of him that was still on that stage in the studio, singing to a brother who couldn't hear anymore. A part of him that was still that boy in Ohio, trying to prove himself worthy of someone's faith. A part of him that was forever kneeling beside a coffin, holding the hand of someone who had made everything possible. And in the quiet moment, Late at night, when the cameras had stopped rolling and the audience had gone home and there was nothing but silence and the sound of his own breathing, Dean Martin would pour a drink and look at the stars above Los Angeles and whisper the same words over and over again. The words he had never gotten to say face to face while Guy was still alive. The words that had to be carried on the wind and on the melodies of 1,000 songs. The words that had become his life's work, his life's prayer, his life's devotion. I'm sorry I couldn't do it while you were here to see it, Guy, but I hope somehow, somewhere, you know? I hope you know that everything you believed in came true. I became what you said I would be. And I did it because you never stopped believing. Not for a second. You believed in me when I was nothing. You believed in me when nobody else would. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. And that belief became the foundation of everything I am. It became the reason I woke up every morning and tried again when I failed. It became the reason I didn't give up when everyone told me I should. It became the reason I became Dean Martin instead of just Dino Crocetti. Dean raised his glass to the stars and drank in silence, an old man still trying to prove something to a brother who had been gone for years but would never truly leave, because that's what love is. It's the thing that survives even death. It's the thing that echoes through all our songs and all our stories. It's the thing that makes us push forward even when everything inside us wants to stop. It's the voice of someone who believes in us, speaking from beyond the grave, saying, "Keep going. You've got this. You're going to be a star. I believe in you." And Dean Martin, the legend, the icon, the man with the perfect voice and the perfect face and the perfect timing, would keep going. He would keep singing. He would keep performing. He would keep carrying his brother with him every single day of his life. In every note, in every gesture, in every moment of perfection, he was able to create on a stage. Because that's what we do for the people we love. We carry them. We honor them. We make sure that their faith in us doesn't die when they do. We make sure that their belief becomes immortal. We make sure that the people who believed in us when we were nothing get to live forever in the hearts of millions through the work we create, the legacy we build, the life we live in their honor. And in doing so, we become a little bit immortal ourselves. We transcend the boundaries of death and time. We reach across the void and touch the people who loved us, the people who made us possible. And in that moment, in that connection that spans the distance between the living and the dead, we finally understand what it all meant. We finally understand that the whole point of everything, the whole reason we're here, is to be worthy of the faith that other people had in us, to be worthy of the belief, to make that belief real in the world, to take that gift and use it to create something beautiful, to take that love and transform it into something that will last long after we're gone. And in that understanding, we find peace. We find purpose. We find the reason why.